Okay, welcome everybody to this is our fourth now presentation of the week. And what is really exciting is that means we're a third of our way through this. So today, Graham is going to talk about no talking in some as something therapeutic. This is something very contentious because Graham and I have fought about this for about 10 years now, to the point where he even once pranked me and mailed me this book. No Talk Therapy, which was really funny because I opened to a random page and it talked about how to ask the miracle question. And I just thought, well, how do you do that without talking? But apparently Graham knows how, and that's what we're here to learn about today. So, Graham, my dear friend, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I won't call anybody out, but I'm glad to see in the room that we got people who can help me, because I might need it later on. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors of the country that I'm on, which is the Jagera and Ugarapul people. That's a bit contentious. There seems to be some debate as to exactly where boundaries and things like that are, and it's one of those sorts of areas. But a beautiful place. You're going to see in the presentation what is just like 60, 70 meters from my front door, which I think is pretty good. Unfortunately, it's not quite the pictures we've got in the background there. But my respects to the ancestors and the elders for looking after the place for so long. Also, I'd like to express my appreciation to the people who took part in my research, because they gave me lots of good ideas, and which I've tried to incorporate. And some of this presentation comes directly out of some specific conversations I was having during that research. And I'd also like to acknowledge the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which is 1,800 mostly clinicians who are just dedicated to learning how to help people who have dissociative responses to what's going on around them. And I am in awe of the knowledge that that group of people have. Not that they're the only ones, but they are probably the largest society in the world that's dedicated to understanding complex trauma and dissociation. I'd also like to acknowledge Joan Halliburton, who's one of those people, and it was her fault that you're doing this presentation is here. Here's another book. I think I can get that up there. Anyway, Joan is a adolescent psychiatrist, and she has written about this model that I'm going to talk to you about today. But she's a talk therapy person. So I tried to figure out, how do I do this when I'm not a therapist? Because guess what? I'm not a therapist. And so it's not right for me to do things that are the domain of therapists. I've got to figure out a way to help people within my skill set, which is doing things. So adventure-based youth work is my thing. So that's why it's a no talk approach to the conversational model. And also, Will, thank you for your mentorship over the years and for putting on this presentation, uh, as you do each year. Oh, here we go. Right. So I'm happy also for people to interject, because, like I said, I'm not a therapist, and I may well have some of this wrong, which would be really good to know early in the presentation rather than leaving it too late. So we're going to be talking about the self. What is the self? Now, Will refers to that little symbol there, which I use in my research as the toilet symbol, but it's actually just a representation that we have a sense of who we are. But early in development, with that, we've got infancy, and then childhood, and then there's a sort of a developmental thing that happens with puberty, and that bridges across to adolescence and adulthood. And then there's another kind of developmental thing, or it's just a social thing, where we enter into parenthood, auntie and uncling people, and grandparenting, and all these different ways of relating to each other are important to who we are in the world. And this isn't a phrase you'll hear, it's just me trying to get my head around it, but attachment engagement is how we learn about who I am versus who you are, where I belong, but also how I'm different to those around me. So all that attachment literature you'll know about tends more in over the 80s, 90s, 2000s was very much about the baby and the mother. And it was mostly talking about that. But as I found out in the research, people have a broader view of that. And if we go back to Bowlby, he was looking at teens, basically, and later age children. So attachment isn't just about mother and baby. There's other sorts of attachment we can have. And all these different attachments help us to figure out who I am and who are the things and people that are important to me. Where do we meet and what keeps us separate? And in normal development, as in what happens for most people, that happens over that sort of infant childhood sort of period, around about 10 years old, give or take a couple of years. We tend to have a pretty good idea of who I am and how I am connected, but also how I am unique and separate. So it's not as if you're one or the other, you're both all the time, but we get an idea of that. But if things don't go well in that early period, that may not happen so well. And we'll talk about a bit more of this later on. And we're going to talk about the proto-conversation as that infant caregiver way of understanding the world when we get to slide 7. So, because I've got a few things to get through before we get there. So my thinking on this comes out of the complex trauma literature. And remember, complex trauma is harm, from my point of view, harm to that sense of self. It's not about specific events. The harm, the trauma, the harm is, to me, specifically about that sense of how I belong and how I'm different too. And having some pretty cohesive ways of understanding those things. And if our early development doesn't go so well, then we may not be able to differentiate between what is me and what is you. Am I doing what you want, or am I doing what I want? Do I belong to you, or am I alien to you? And I don't know if you've heard the term scaregiver, but it's a play on the word, obviously, where an infant or a child is dependent on the caregiver, but the caregiver also could be abused, but it could be that the caregiver just isn't coping with the world and has their big meltdowns and things. That dysregulates the children they're caring for. And so the child or infant then needs to have a relationship with the caregiver, but is also often frightened about being in the presence of the caregiver. And that can make it really confusing. What am I? Who are you? Where do we overlap? Am I doing this to please you and to stop you from having your moment, or am I doing it because I need to? So it can get very confusing if those early developmental things aren't working so well. So here's a nice complicated diagram. And I'll get to the diagram in a sec. Let's just go through a few points about complex trauma and the sense of self. These are from the ISSTD's, one of their fact sheets on what is complex trauma. Complex trauma tends to be in situations where the harm is repeated or it's ongoing, really difficult to get away from, which in the work that we do, we need to think about whether young people we're working with are volunteers or not, because this is directly related to conditions that can cause complex trauma. And occurs within a personal relationship. So again, we're talking about that attachment engagement. But all of us are in the room because we have some sort of practitioner, professional, paraprofessional role in providing care to others. That puts us in that. So if there is harm to the sense of self that comes out of our involvement, then we're actually starting to become the perpetrator. Begins in childhood because it affects a child's development. So theoretically, from this perspective, complex trauma isn't something that would happen with an adult because they've already gone through all that developmental stuff. They have achieved whatever is going to be their sense of self. And that can change, of course, but I think of that more as complex PTSD, what happens after the adolescent developmental period. So complex trauma is really about that growing up period of the first 10, 20 years of life. And last one, the situations that create complex trauma tend to be secretive. So they often happen within like obviously within a family, and the family, to all intents and purposes, is fine to the rest of the community, but what's happening at home may not be. Or it could be that there's a group, there's gymnasts or whatever it was that NASA had something to do with over in America, a coach that was abusing the girls that were in his team. It could be churches, schools, any of those things. And in Australia, we've had that Royal Commission where we really dug into that sort of stuff. So that creates then, if we look across at that diagram, and you don't need the detail of the diagram, but if you've got a sense of who you are in those conditions are happening there, you might have one sense of who you are that relates to the caregiver when they're in a good place. And then if the caregiver becomes a scaregiver, maybe you've got a different sense of self so that you can have one part that is afraid, and another sense of yourself that forgets about that and is able to engage when the caregiver is going well, just as an idea. And then we can have various other senses of self that operate in isolation, or they're not fully connected with the whole sense of who we are as people. And a lot of this is quite unconscious, by the way. People may not be aware that they've got these different things. But if you think about yourself, your own self right now, you have different ways of being you in different contexts. I think that's normal. But when it starts interfering with our functioning, like we can't remember where we were this morning because that was a sense of self that I'm not present in at the moment, we start to have problems. That's called dissociation. I'm not going to go into dissociation in any great detail because I'm focused on just how do we restore, for the young people we work with, how do we restore development so that they start picking up those things, those attachment experiences that help them to develop a sense of who they are, and a sense of who you are, and what the other things are in their world. So that model just gives you an idea. I think that was a representation of, I think it was about 30 different people with dissociative diagnoses, and they're just trying to explain how that all fits together. Just an idea. So let's go on to the use of self. Now, in social work, in particular, we talk about the therapist's use of self. What is that? With that beginning, the sense of the use of self is not about who you are as a person. Oh, I'm a professional and I barrack for this football team. That's not really important, because how do you use that when working with somebody who needs some help? If we're thinking about that attachment engagement, it's much more immediate. It's more about how you are present in the room with your sense of self. So what we need from practitioners, in my view, is we need a good sense of who you are, of yourself, to realize and know and project out that you're not perfect. So it's okay for other people not to be perfect, but you're good enough. I mean, you're also fallible. So you can, sorry, I've got people coming into the room and I don't think Will's seeing the admit button. So making mistakes is good because it makes you human. And it means that you can identify when maybe we didn't do something too well in that relationship, and you can help explain what you did wrong. That would help the person who you've wronged to understand that it actually happened, because in their world, their experience, maybe those sorts of things happen, are not explained, and are not apologized for. And so they're not really aware that that was a transgression. So when we do something that upsets somebody or impinges on the dignity of the person we're trying to help, I think that's a real good opportunity to show that you're not getting it all right, and that this was something that isn't the way we should be working with each other. So from a conversational model, they're thinking about responding to whatever the person is saying and doing. So there's expressions through their body language as well as through the words. And how do we respond with that, with our sense of self, so that they can have a healing experience from that. And now we'll get to this now in slide 5. So self as a tool. There's me being a tool with a belt full of tools, doing what I do. So I've got my gloves and my abseiling gear there, and I haven't got my helmet on, but I'm about to head off, and I'm being silly. A note up there in the corner to Strauss Um, and she's got a book. I'll just check it. Yeah. So that was basically her field guide for people who are working with complex with adult with complex trauma. Really nice book about relationships, therapeutic relationships. There's much, I think, more nuanced than you sometimes get from literature. And again, here's the other book that Will was showing you before. It sits on my bookshelf to hand. So let's work through the self as a tool. First of all, know who you are. Think about your sense of self, who you are, how you're related to the rest of the world, how you organized internally, and understand how you respond to different situations. I think that's pretty important we know ourselves if we're going to use our sense of self in practice. So a fair bit of self-reflection. Know what you can provide. Understand what good enough care is and where it may become not good enough in care. And you've got to be a safe container. So the example given here is I know of cases where people have talked about their story. It's been so upsetting to hear that people can be treated the way that they were early on. And the therapist shows distress. Now, I think it's okay to respond to that because that's being human. We're being empathetic and sympathetic. But if the person who's telling a story thinks they may be harming you because the story is too much, then they may well decide to stop telling you things. And then how do you do your therapeutic work if they're actually judging how much to give out that you can tolerate? It shouldn't be about what you can tolerate. We should be safe containers so they can say, okay, I can put this stuff there with this person, and although they are showing sadness, etc., I'm not hurting them by telling them my story. I think that's a fairly important thing. Um, and reflexivity with how we are in the room with the person. So this is all talk therapy theory. How we are in the room with the person, we're being reflexive, a little bit like caregivers and infants do. Somebody will say something or demonstrate something with the shift of their shoulders. Theoretically, we should be trying to respond to that, not be a mirror, because that's not the job. The job is to be reflexive to what's coming to you as information and responding to that in a way that a good enough, decent person should respond, which may actually be fairly unusual or unique in the life of the person who's talking to you because they may have been surrounded by family members who are all just barely coping with life and not really giving them that decent, caring, fairly balanced person's view of the situations that are going on for them. I hope that's not being too vague. I don't want to get too specific because the specifics aren't really important. And then healing. How do we use ourselves for healing? So when we reflexively respond to the information coming to us, we've got an opportunity to interpret that, to show some sort of reaction to it. Again, we're still coping with the story, but we're going, oh, yeah. And so you can see how it's not actually a word response. It's all your minimal encouragement. What are the solar things, Will? Um, what are those? Come on, you teach this stuff.
It's
The
open posture,
open posture,
you
leaning
lean
forward,
forward, lean back.
yeah,
Yeah.
all those
Eye
things.
contact.
So yeah, that's it. So all of those things are how we can respond in the therapy room without necessarily saying anything. It's all the minimal encourages, etc., like that. We're not really trying to encourage. We're trying to respond. We're trying to give some sort of interpretation that is reasonable for most people. The person telling the story then goes, "Oh, that was a different response. That person has responded to what I've said in this way. Oh, what does that mean for me? Does that change the way I'm thinking about that experience?" And so it's a tennis game of saying something, being reflexive to it, and then there's an opportunity to reinterpret and then present some more information. And this thing goes on through the conversation. And that helps them to sort of um, to consider again their sense of self. How are they in relation to this person? Those things that happened to me, were they appropriate or not appropriate? And if they weren't appropriate, was there a boundary violation? Was there an overlap of me and you? And you can see how in the conversation they will be able to reconsider some of those things. But that's not what I do. And I'm coming to that pretty quickly, I promise. So the psychodynamic conversational theory, which Halliburton, Russell Meares is the person who really, I think, kicked this off, comes out of the psychodynamic stuff, as I understand it. The first presentation that somebody in Wikipedia said was 1874. It was about thermodynamics. And they put it back there. I'm not sure about that, but it kind of arises out of psychoanalysis, but it's not psychoanalysis. In my research, I was talking a lot about ecological dynamics. It's where there's the different organisms and things around us influence how we feel and what we do. If the weather changes, we get hot or we get cold or we get sunburn. We respond to these things. If the wind's blowing, we hear the leaves. Does that make us feel good? Does it make us feel on edge? We're constantly adjusting to the things around us. In a therapy room, you're constantly adjusting between the two people that are in there. And it's related to object relations. I'm not going to talk about that because it's not my thing. But it's also related to narrative therapy, person-centered, all that humanistic stuff that we learn. It all is involved in the psychodynamic approach. So, in short, talk with people. And in my research, the young people were saying just chatting. And they said, I think I could probably swear, Will. They said, you can just be talking about shit. You can just be taking the piss out of the leaders. It doesn't matter. But it's just that constant chatting is really helpful to figuring out who I am and who these other people are. So I thought that was really interesting coming from a teenager, that it was just the unscripted talk that didn't matter the content, but it was how we interact with each other, how we reply and respond to those conversations. So how we're reflexive, and think about the tennis analogy. We want to keep that game of tennis going, but we don't, not just serving the ball straight back. We're also doing some things with it so that we're moving around the court. We're not trying to trick people, not at all. We're just trying to be a reasonable human responding to another human's story of distress. So the proto-conversation. Meares talks about this in detail. There's an article there you can dig into if you wish. So we know about caregiver and baby interactions. There's a photo of one happening right there on the screen, just a stock photo. Like babies and caregivers are constantly interacting. It just doesn't stop. When people try to count it, it's one every 3 seconds in exchange of information, something like that. We're not mirroring. We're not trying to just do the same. A caregiver is trying to educate. It's trying to help them develop. It's trying to to introduce different things to them, concepts, but also to keep them at a baseline of regulation so that the baby is having a good day. Nothing better than a baby laughing. Yeah. So we're not being a mirror. We're actually leading this. Now, this is me simplifying Meares' fairly detailed writing. There seems to be three roles for the therapist or the practitioner when we're being reflexive. One, we amplify the thing the person has just expressed to us. So, with the baby, you go, wow, when we wouldn't do that with an adult. But we want to amplify something that is probably a useful thing to understand, to tag that, to point, say that thing there, that's really useful and not harmful. I think those to be able to use our expressions to inform a person that, yeah, that experience, that's legit and it's okay. We might shape the response. So if they say something to us and we go, oh, and that indicates, oh, there's something wrong with that. And maybe what you're saying as a joke actually to me isn't a joke. That's, oh, wow, that was a bit weird. I'm using words now, but you can express the concepts through your face and through your body language of, oh, are you okay? That was a bit of a violation. You're very brave to have come through that. And you could change your face 2 or 3 times in response to a statement to say those things without actually using words. And if you think about how quickly the brain works, they're possibly noticing those things more than they're noticing the content of your words anyway, is my suspicion. The third thing that caregivers do is lead the baby analogy is lead the baby to safety. So if the baby is dysregulated and crying, we pick it up, we go for a walk, we're soothing, we take it away from the stress or whatever it is to help them get back to homeostasis or a feeling of contentment. And I think that often in the work that I'm doing outside, I'm doing a lot of that work. I'm trying to help them to regulate by co-regulating. None of those things, amplifying, shaping, or leading to safety, none of those require you to say anything. You can just be responding by body gestures and the things you do. Now, Will get a bit sick of this because, yes, of course, we're going to use words. We're humans. We use words all the time, but it's the content of the words is not important. Your tone might be, but it's more, and when we do have words, especially when we're outdoors, it's, can you, is it okay that I adjust this piece of gear? So we're talking about things, but we're not asking questions about your mother and that sort of stuff, which, the theoretical psychoanalysis type questions. Hope that's fairly obvious. Now, so the proto conversation sorry. Back there we had infant and baby. Now let's look at another developmental experience. In this picture, we've got an adult, 2 teenagers walking up a road with packs on their backs. They're probably talking about stuff. And as the people in my research said, they're just probably talking about shit, stuff that's happening around them. But as they're doing it, the adult, if they're a practitioner in particular, they're a caregiver, they can be checking, are we going too fast? Have you got a stone in your shoe? Do you need to put some sunscreen on? Oh, look, isn't that a beautiful view? I love those trees. Look at the shape of those. Oh, it's very dusty here. How's your asthma going? We're demonstrating care and the things that decent people would do for each other. And I think those things are really, really important. As they're telling us stories, maybe we keep an antenna up to go, oh, that story actually, you're laughing about this person, but you're laughing about that person being hurt. Were they okay? Or are we just, because if we're just mirroring, we would laugh when they laugh about a story about somebody being hurt. But that's not a normal human reaction to watching some other person being injured. So as we're going in the conversations, we give them a reasonable person's response to the things that they're talking about, or the things they're doing, and that sort of thing. So you can see how that's different to being with the baby. And here we've got, just to spell out some of the theory from my research about how we can talk through the actions we've got. Here we've got that sense of self in the middle. We've got the five domains that I have in my research, if you've read it. And again, a lot of this comes back to what Strauss was talking about. So the practitioner is really vital in here, but they're really limited to inside that social domain. And they're probably working with the mind as connection. So what is the person thinking, both deliberately, but also what are some of the unconscious sort of back of the head type thinking that's going on in response to the situation we're in? Like, are they feeling sad because the pack's really heavy and they don't know how far they've got to go? So how would we help the person sense of mindful connection to the world to understand how long that heavy load will be on your back for, how we can adjust it, and those sorts of things. The other three parts are aspects of time. So how long have we been doing this? Is it the right time to do this thing? Is there a connection to another time in your life from this thing that we're doing? The activity, whatever it is that's going on, walking down a road, looking for a geocache, doing math, practice, all these things can be the things we're doing while we're having this sort of proto conversation. And obviously what's going on in the natural world if we're outside or inside. For instance, I've got two dachshunds at my feet, and I am aware, even though I'm talking to you, about what they're going to do next, and whether they're going to tell the entire street that there is another dog somewhere. So there is always other things going on outside of the interaction we're having with the person we're trying to help. So how do we respond to these senses of self that the person we're trying to help might have? If we go back to that idea that with the bubbles, that they may have not completed the developmental task of discovering their sense of self, which is entirely normal for all children and into teenagehood. So this is not as if we're only working with the most brutally harmed people in the world. This is just a developmental task that all of us working with young people can be involved in. And yeah, so here we've got some words over on the left. The helper is the consistency that may have been missing from their life. That you might be able to provide some of those missing pieces. We would include whatever self states, those bubbles that occur in front of us. We just include them with what's going on. So if we notice a behavioural change or a postural change or something like that, don't have to worry about it. We just make sure constantly that the person we're working with, you're constantly inviting them to be involved in whatever the activity is, to notice the nature around them, to keep a sense of how much time has elapsed. And we just keep doing that because we may have different senses of self entering into the dynamic between the practitioner and the person being helped. I wouldn't be announcing new arrivals like, oh, that's a new self state. Haven't seen that one before. Hello, my name's Graham. I wouldn't be as overt as that, but I have when a person's dysregulated at the top of an abseil site, they clearly were not present. I often reminded them as I was trying to help them back away from the source of stress, which was the edge of the cliff. I kept saying, my name is Graham. We're here at the cliff. You're safe there. Let's move back. My name is Graham. I'm running this thing. I'm taking you back so you're safe. I just kept repeating that because I didn't know what was going on. I was just operating off, a little bit of knowledge. It wasn't a deliberate practice of mine. It was just me trying to help a young person who was frozen at the top of a cliff. And so I had an idea that maybe that there's different senses of self trying to cope with the situation, and some may be more in control of what that young person was doing at any moment than others, and they might circulate through. I've heard young people in the room may not realize a bit of the old Rolodex, I think, where you've got all these business cards on a spindle and that you just go through until you find one. I've heard people, I've seen them refer to dissociation and they're not coping with the situation, which may just be standing in front of the fridge trying to figure out what to put on a sandwich, and they're going through the Rolodex trying to figure out which sense of self is best placed to make that sandwich. So I'm thinking if that's happening for the young person who is otherwise looking frozen at the top of the cliff and they're trying to find the internal resource, that sense of self that can protect them, maybe I need to make sure they are aware that I'm here and I'm going to keep them safe. It's important in our practice, I think, to stay in now time. We don't want to be going back and replaying the harms of the past. That's a therapist's job. If you're a therapist, and we can talk about that afterwards, but I'm not, so I have to stay in the now and keep them as much as possible, help them to orient to this is what's going on right now. We're not entering into those other spaces in your mind that people tend to go to. The PTSD thing of flashbacks, that sort of idea. We don't want them to enter that and be stuck there because that wasn't real nice. We want to try and have people in now time. It's a good idea to notice what they're linking to. And often I've had young people just spontaneously suddenly get an idea that, oh, it's really interesting. Or they're doing something different. I don't normally do this. And I just help them to notice that, explore it a little bit. I don't think it's useful to overdo that. I think we just want to continue to incorporate all these different self states that may occur so that they're getting along together. I think of every individual I'm working with as a group, and I want them all to get along and sort of know each other a bit. And that's all I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to do anything particularly magic in terms of treatment for dissociation. The last one is the easiest. Our aim is to develop skills. It doesn't matter what skills they are. If they're better at something after they've been with you, then that's good because they've had to test themselves. They've had to bring in information and learn how to process it and learn how to stay with that thing that they're developing a skill about. So here's the strange photo. I was working, this is a photo from the therapeutic residential service that I was working in, and I had young people that weren't very well regulated. They were sometimes a bit aggressive with each other, and they were very often dismissive of the staff. And I had one particular young fella at the time who'd been with us for only a couple of weeks, and he was not attaching to anyone for very good reason. But it was really causing him to be very alone and fairly vulnerable to gravitating towards other young people who may not necessarily be the best role models for him. So we're trying to figure out ways of connecting with this bloke. I noticed he liked toasted sandwiches. It was winter, so I asked him if he wanted lunch. He said, yeah. I said, do you want a toasty? Yep. I saw, oh, we've got wholemeal, we've got white bread, we've got thick and thin sliced. And I asked him, what do you want, the wholemeal or the white? Oh, the white. The thick or the thin? The fucking thick, Graham. He was getting a bit frustrated. I was trying to play with the idea of it. And then I looked at the ingredients and said, oh, we've got this and we've got that. What would you like on it? And he's playing computer games at the time and throwing answers back at me. And I made these toasties. And I went outside and found a bush and plucked off some greenery to jazz it up. I stood it on its edges so it wouldn't get all soggy if they didn't come over straight away. I set the table, set it up the same for each person, but slightly different so that they could have a choice about which one they sat at. And then I called them over for lunch. And my aim was demonstrate care, demonstrate interest in what the finer points of their needs and preferences, and to do something that might be a bit funny and a bit interesting and help them feel a connection, a belongingness, and just some fun. He walked over, grabbed the green thing, threw that across the room, grabbed the toasty, walked away, took one bite, got halfway back to the TV, and he turns around and says, Graham, these are fucking great. I thought, yay, I've done something useful. So there was him not actually wanting to have any relationship with me at all, but I was trying to respond to his needs. I was trying to do something that would demonstrate a high level of care, perhaps, well, a decent level of care that may not have been familiar to him. So I hope that's a useful example. Here, I'm hoping this will work for me. So this is 75 meters down the road from my place. I just stood at the corner, and this is, so if I was going to work with a young person in this area, let's have a look at the environment, what opportunities there are to do things together, to share a moment, but also to be separate. So you're always providing care and they are the cared for, and sometimes those roles do get reversed, which is fine. But we've got a duty as an older person and as a practitioner to be providing care. So let's have a look around in my environment. And it finishes there. It may not be clear, but that's like an access way to a stormwater drain so that it can be cleared out, etc. So in that very short video, we've got a path that is suitable for two people to walk side by side along when there's 3.5 kilometers of that. So there's a lot of walking we can just do in a companionable way. There's clearly water, there's grassy areas to go to. There's different places we can access the water. There's bridges, and under the bridge, by the way, is a geocache, which took me a year to find. It was very cunningly hidden. And we could even go down to the stormwater drain if we wanted to, because I quite often do, because I pick up all the rubbish that's in there. I often pick up rubbish as I'm going around. That by itself for young people is often really interesting. Why do you do that? What's the meaning of this rubbish being on the ground for you? And they ended up being quite used to just giving me all their rubbish because they knew that I would pick it up and then I had a sore back, and they figured out after a while of teasing me, they realized they were just causing me pain by throwing it on the ground, so they just give it to me. So that was cool. Um, what's also in the environment, there's birds, it's a walking track, so we've got dogs being walked, and that's always interesting when young people meet dogs. There's something that happens there. In terms of the attachment engagement, dogs can be really helpful. There's going to be other people, strangers, and the stress around these people you don't know who might smile at you and say hello, especially when we're in a more of a bushland setting where they think that the only people in the bushland are people who are going to murder you, and I stop and realize that we've actually met each other before. That's completely thrown some kids. Um, and there's often bikes going around, and that can be a bit scary. What we're talking about there, they're all daily stressors. They're interesting, they're engaging, they're things we can get involved with, but there's little bits of stress involved with a lot of those things. Our job is to observe them interact with the stressor and help them to regulate, and then demonstrate some sort of engagement with the stressor that keeps them safe, so that they're learning as they're going on the journey with us about how to interact with the rest of the world in a safe way. To me, that's the proto-conversation. Happening, but through doing things rather than the content, any particular miracle questions or whatever. Now, here's a screenshot from a video of a different program where the idea, thinking around the program, is that adversity toughens you up. It builds character. But those blue things you're looking at, there's 4 of them. That's 4 people's accommodation for the night. That's how they slept. It was a wet, windy, sleety, cold day or evening, and the kids are frozen, really, really cold. I happened to be at the other side of the Grand Canyon on that night, and I remember that week it was cold. It wasn't pleasant, and they had people out there sleeping under tarps. So I'm thinking, how do you go about the amplifying, the shaping, and the leading to safety when kids are just trying to cope with what's around them? Some of this would actually, if the young person was a volunteer, this is part of a can we hack it, and they're keen to try it. Yeah, there's a lot of really good things in there where you could lead, you could model, you could have that proto conversation in helping them to cope and protecting them from the harshness of the elements, etc., and demonstrating good care. But that doesn't look like people are really demonstrating good care in that campsite. So I think we need to be careful about ensuring that the young person is not feeling threatened when we're out doing our things. And I'm hoping this idea of the conversational model gives us some reasons for this is no longer a helpful conversation. This is now not a daily stressor. This is more than a daily stressor. This is distressing. And then we're really entering the world of dissociating the self states of the young person through the experience that we're providing, because they're trying to cope. And if they're trying to cope, I think we've crossed a boundary, a line of what is helpful and therapeutic. I've gone a bit over time. So just back to that idea of dissociation being lots of different self states, where a young person's job really is to draw them together to a reasonably coherent sense of self, or a few senses of self that are appropriate to the different places they hang out. That's what we're trying to do. And this is the ISSTD's conditions of what causes complex trauma. So again, repeated and ongoing, difficult to escape from. The caregivers are involved. It's during childhood, it's kept secret. So if we've got those sorts of things going on in our programs, we're probably contributing to the harm rather than healing that harm, because we're supposed to be providing the opposite of those 5 conditions if we're going to be treating complex trauma. And so thank you for listening. I realize now we've gone to 48 minutes, which is more than I was expecting. It's probably because I didn't rehearse. There's a few things going on for me in the last few weeks. So apologies for that. What was missing from that? What did I get wrong? What's helpful? I'd like to hear from the audience, and I'll stop talking for a while.